So this is the second of two videos discussing species concept and classifying organisms. So if you've missed the first video, you need to go back and begin with it. And so I'm carrying on from discussing the morphological species concept and the biological species concept. And so now we're at our third and final species concept, which is the phylogenetic species concept. And so phylogeny is a term in biology that describes the evolutionary history of an organism. And so this species concept is going to identify species based on their evolutionary relationships. So basically how they evolved over time and what their relationship is to previously existing species. And often this includes an evaluation of their DNA and their genetic profiles. And often we represent phylogeny by looking at what's called a phylogenetic tree, and it's almost like a family tree, except it's done for organisms. And so, if we're looking at this is a phylogenetic tree of certain species of elephants, right? And so we have Asian elephants, which have their own characteristics, African elephants, which tend to be larger. And then we have African forest elephants, right? And so these three different elephants, they're all elephants, but they're all their own species of elephants. And so if we were to take a look at their phylogenetic tree, then we can see that the African savanna elephants and the African forest elephants are more closely related in terms of their DNA. So here we've identified a specific species based on unique DNA sequences. And so, so it's like the closer the branches are together, the more closely related are their DNA sequences. And that's how we organize organisms on a phylogenetic tree. And so here we can see that, elephants might be more closely related to each other than, say, something else that might be branching off this phylogenetic tree at a more distance from each other. So in more general terms, this is how a phylogenetic tree really works, right? So you have these, at the very ends of the branches, you might have species A, B, C, D, and E. And so the branches basically detect how similarly related or how similar the DNA sequences are of species. So when I look at this phylogenetic tree, I can see that C and D are more closely related than, let's say, B. But I can also say that E is more distantly related to all of the other species because it's kind of its own little branch, right? So the branch off points show you how more similar species are to each other. So we're looking at ancestors all the way to present day species, and so the distance that one species is from another, and the more sort of distant the branches are from each other, the more distantly related the species are. And so very, very briefly, this is an example of a phylogenetic tree that examines the evolution of the human. Right here we are at Homo sapiens, but we can see all of our potential ancestors by examining this phylogenetic tree. So here we can see chimpanzees, right, separating from another very similar but evolved primate, and so on and so forth. And so you may be thinking, well, what are the pros and what are the cons of this way of classifying organisms? The great thing about it is that it can be applied to extinct species, right? Species that no longer exist, but maybe being able to classify those extinct species is helpful in helping us to understand species that currently exist on our planet. Whereas if we're looking at the biological species concept, we don't know how it might have interbred with other organisms and whether that they produce fertile offspring. We may not know from a morphological standpoint what their varying visible characteristics are, right? But certainly we know that if we can look at its DNA, if we're able to determine its DNA sequence, that we can classify it based on its relationship to other organisms simply by that DNA sequence. So DNA analysis we know is super reliable, and so It's an excellent way of knowing the relationship between those extinct species and also living species, and how they are to each other. So the cons of this is that, we may not know, we may not be able to get the DNA from all species, specifically those that are extinct or that have yet to be found, right? So we may not know the evolutionary histories for all species, and that may be because we just don't have their DNA to analyze. So as a starting point, I'd like you to take a look at, before I move on to the next section, in your textbook on page 16, numbers 1 and 2. Take a look at those, give those a try, maybe reread this section 1.1 in your textbook if you're struggling with some of the ideas, and that may help to clarify. So I'm going to pause the video, take a second to do those questions, and then come back and watch the remaining component of the. And so the next part of the lesson, I want to introduce you to the concept of taxonomy. And so taxonomy is sort of a little bit like nomenclature in chemistry. It's the science of classifying organisms, but we're going to name them in a certain way. And so taxonomy serves to identify organisms. It's going to help us figure out the relationship between those organisms as well, based on how we classify them. So it's an extension of the phylogenetic tree. And so who came up with all this? Who set the rules for how it is that we organize and name and classify organisms? Well, it's this guy. His name is Carl Linnaeus, and he was an 18th century scientist who developed our taxonomic system. And so as you can imagine, in the 18th century, there wasn't a whole lot of technology. And so what Linnaeus did is he based his classification on physical and structural features of the organism. And so the more the organisms seem to have in common in terms of, maybe structural features or behavioral features, then the closer their relationship was. And the taxonomic system, and this is going to be important for you to know, and so I want you to make some cue cards and learn these, was that he decided that there would be 8 main ranks. Okay, so going from very, very broad categories to very, very specific. So he called those, the domains, and then kingdoms, phylums, class, order, family, genus, and then species, of course, species being the most specific. So this is sort of akin to you, again, going back to classifying your clothes. So maybe you have these really broad categories within your closet of organizing your clothing. Maybe you've organized them according to, shirts, and then maybe pants, right? Or tops and then bottoms, and maybe some accessories and so on and so forth, right? So let me see here. Right? So maybe within the tops you have maybe your short sleeved shirts and your long sleeved shirts, and on and on and on. So, as you can go from broad to super, super specific. Right? Maybe once you've classified your short versus your long sleeve shirts, then you go into specific colors of each of those, and so on and so forth. Right? So again, I want you to make some cue cards and learn these, because tomorrow in class I'm going to be quizzing you on them. Okay? I expect you to be able to recite these verbatim in order: domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So if you need to find an acronym to help you remember that, then go ahead and do that, and I would love for you to share that with the class. So in an effort to help you understand those different levels of classification, those different ranks, here would be the breakdown for the gray wolf, right? So we know that the domain, and we're going to be learning these, the domain for gray wolf is eukarya, and so we're going to learn what that really means. We're not really there yet. So the taxon would be eukarya, and so aside from the gray wolf, there are also 4 to 10 million other species in this taxon. Lots of organisms belong to domain eukarya, right? Tons and tons of them. Here I can see some kind of mushroom, some trees, and so on and so forth. But then we can further classify and say, well, this gray wolf is in kingdom Animalia, right? A gray wolf is an animal, and approximately 2 million species belong to kingdom Animalia, right? We have chickens, we have, I can't really see this, it looks a little blurry here. You know, squirrels, we have, it looks like some kind of lizard here, and so on and so forth. So as we move on to the different ranks, we see we're getting more and more specific. So the gray wolf belongs to phylum Chordata. Organisms within phylum Chordata have some sort of a backbone, a notochord, right? So here we see that we have only about 50,000 organisms that belong to the taxon Chordata, phylum Chordata. Right, so here the squirrels are, and there's our gray wolf. Further classifying, we can classify the gray wolf as belonging to class Mammalia, so all of the mammals, and there are about 5,000 species of mammals that exist. And a little bit later on this unit, we'll learn what characterizes an organism as a mammal, as opposed to an organism that is not a mammal. Okay, further on we have carnivora. Now we're down to only 270 species that are carnivores, carnivora. And so as we go down here, we're seeing we're funneling these organisms into more and more specific categories. Okay, then we get into families, which is Canidae. So again, we're at, you know, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, Canidae. 34 organisms belong to Canidae. Then the genus is Canis. So Canis, only 7 species of organisms belong to the genus Canis. And then finally we get down to species, and there's only 1 species of gray wolf. You'll always only see 1 in the species category, and we call it Canis lupus. Canis lupus for gray wolf. So there we have it. So again, going from very, very broad category of domain to very, very specific category in the species category. And so here's another example of a phylogenetic tree where they've identified species based on their taxons. And here we see the ranks here. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about the difference between a rank and a taxon, because I think that is a little bit confusing. So if we start at the order, right, so of course we're looking at all of these being animals in kingdom Animalia, but we're going to start with their order, and we're looking at order Carnivora. So all of the organisms in this phylogenetic tree are going to be carnivores, but then we see it branch off, right? So we see it branches off into families. So based on families, here we have Felidae, and so that typically means like cat-like organisms. And then we have Mustelidae, so sort of like rodent-like organisms, and then Canidae, which are, of course, sort of dog-like species. So then we see Canis, right? So Canis, and then here we see Canis familiaris, which is the, you know, domestic dog, and Canis lupus. Okay, but if we look at one other branch, so it appears to me that, you know, here's our skunk and our otter. It looks like skunks and otters are more closely related to dogs and wolves than, say, cat-like species like the panther here, right? So here we have several different genuses, Canis, Lutra, Memphitis, and Panthera, and each of these would be, you know, have specific characteristics that would differentiate them. So it's all about just sort of becoming classifying in more and more specific ways. Okay, so let's go back to this idea of the difference between the rank and the taxon. Okay, so here we have the ranks. So order, family, genus, species, those are ranks. Okay, those are just the broad names, and those apply to any specific, any organism whatsoever, right? So that's just your rank. However, if we're talking about your taxon, the taxon is the specific name within that rank. So for instance, I would say that the taxon, wolves belong to the taxon Carnivora within the rank of order. Okay, so within the rank of family, wolves belong to the taxon Canidae. Okay, so family is a rank, but the taxon within that rank is